And you're live.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And I am so excited to see such a large and robust crowd here for this evening's discussion about, of all things, Bakelite plastic. Who knew? I'm thrilled because I'm a collector and a fan myself, and I've had the pleasure of spending time with our panel and moderator this afternoon and just now in the green room. And they're all delightful and so smart, and we're going to have a great time this evening. I know you're not here to hear me talk, so I'm going to keep my remarks brief, but I do have a little bit of housekeeping to do before we begin our discussion. First of all, please do keep on chatting away in the chat. I see you all exchanging messages already. Please let us know where you're from and why you're here tonight, anything you'd like us to know about yourself. However, if you have a question, we're going to do a Q&A session toward the end of our program this evening. And rather than post your question in the chat, which makes it a little harder for us to keep track of, if you would do me the favor of posting your question down at the bottom of your screen where you see the Ask a Question section. And another fun thing about that is that you can look at other people's questions and upvote them if you have the same question. So please take advantage of that opportunity to pose questions to this panel of absolute experts. While we're looking at that part of the screen, I'd encourage you just to raise your glance a tiny bit to that long green bar that says your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum. Please donate here. That's absolutely true. Your support is vital. We've been delighted and proud and excited to offer virtual programs, sometimes as many as 4 or 5 a week throughout the pandemic. And we have connected with audiences all over the world and really had a great time of it. But while we rarely have charged a registration fee for any of these programs, you have to know that they're not free for us to put on. There are a number of costs associated with mounting these programs. So I just encourage you, if you're able, and if you want to see us continue offering these virtual programs, anything you can do to help by clicking that donate button will be not only very deeply appreciated by the staff and board of trustees of the museum, but also every penny put to extremely good use. So thank you in advance for your help. Now, normally I have a copy of the book that we're talking about. Our copies did not quite arrive yet. I'm sure that they're going to be here very soon, but normally I have a copy to show you. When I invite our guests up on screen, I'm going to ask them to hold the book up, but I would draw your attention to the link in the chat that allows you to order a signed copy of Beyond Bakelite, and know that not only do you get a signed copy, but your purchase supports and benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum. So thank you very much for that. I want to thank our sponsors for tonight's program and all of our virtual programs. Tonight's program is sponsored by the Wish You Well Foundation and by Connecticut Public, WNPR. And it's produced in part with support honoring the legacy of Frank Lord, who was a beloved trustee and whose legacy we are delighted to honor through these public programs, which he would have loved. We have tons of these programs on board. I encourage you to visit our website, marktwainhouse.org, to learn more about them. We do have a couple of really important live events coming up for those of you in the greater Hartford area and beyond. On November 30th, our Mark Twain's birthday lecture honoring David Baldacci, who's a trustee and generous supporter of the museum. And then the next night on December 1st, we are having our Mark Twain American Voice in Literature Awards ceremony, where David, the founder and benefactor of this award, will be presenting the award to Stephen Graham Jones for his novel, The Only Good Indians. So please do join us if you're in the area and able. Both events are free and open to the public. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel, Dr. Joris Mercelis. And I know I wasn't going to say that right of practice, but maybe Joris will say it for me again once he gets on screen. He's assistant professor in the Department of History of Science and Technology at Johns Hopkins University and the author of Beyond Bakelite, Leo Bakeland and the Business of Science, Science and Invention. We're also joined by Hugh Carricker, the great-grandson of Leo Bakeland and the executive producer of the documentary All Things Bakelite, which we'll be seeing a little clip from this evening. Bud Mkhitaryan, award-winning author and filmmaker who's currently doing research on Leo Bakeland in his journals and our moderator, Dr. Jeffrey Meikle, Professor of American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, and the author of American Plastic, A Cultural History. So please, everybody, join me in giving a great big Mark Twain House welcome to our guests this evening. Please join us. And it takes a moment for all of them to get on camera and mic, so bear with us. Welcome and good evening, all of you. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Evening all.
A pleasure.
So Jeff, as our moderator, when the time comes, would you be so kind as to let me know when you'd like me to come back up and help with the Q&A toward the end?
I'll certainly do that.
All right.
I'd just like to add my welcome to everyone who's listening, and also to say what an honor it is to be here participating in this. I want to say a little bit about how I got into an interest in Bakelite, and then ask each of the members on the panel to say a little bit about it. As Jennifer said, I'm a professor of American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm a historian of design and technology. And my first book was on industrial design. I wrote it a long time ago. It was my dissertation. And when I was doing it, I realized that the industrial designers of the 1930s were heavily involved, invested in designing for plastic, new materials. And I couldn't find a history of the plastics industry. So I decided, okay, I'm going to write one. And that became my second book, American Plastics, A Cultural History, which was published about 25 years ago. And I got heavily interested in Leo Baekeland, looked at his diaries at the Smithsonian, and made him the center of one of the chapters of the book. So that's how I got involved in what we are discussing tonight, Bakelite plastic and Leo Baekeland, the chemist who invented Bakelite. But I guess I'd like to have Joris say a little bit about how he got involved with Bakelite as we move forward. And then Hugh, great-grandson of Leo Baekeland, and then Bud, who was involved with the making of the film. So Joris?
Sure, thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you, Jennifer, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be a part of this panel. So I became interested in Bakelite and started to research Bakelite and Bakelite in the context of a research project at Ghent University in Belgium. So about a century after the invention of Bakelite in 1907, so about in 2007, there started to be an interest on the part of the history department at Ghent University and in the Museum for the History of Science in Ghent to develop a joint project relevant to the history of the city and also relevant more broadly. And they ended up coming up with the idea of having someone study Bakeland, not just as an inventor, but also as an entrepreneur. And so I ended up becoming the graduate student doing this research. I had the opportunity to kind of develop my own angle, kind of focus on certain teams I found especially interesting, but that's kind of how it started. And the revised version of my dissertation was published last year by the MIT Press. And as Jennifer encouraged me to show the copy of the book, I was going to show it right here. So it's called Beyond Bakelite, Leo Bakeland and Business of Science and Invention.
Thank you, Joris. And Hugh Carricker.
Hi, everybody. I live in Reading, Connecticut, where the famous Mark Twain Library is. And my wife and I support the library and are very close to Mark Twain when he was living here at the turn of the century. And I think he died here, actually. But his library is wonderful. And I showed my movie at the library, and it was a very wonderful experience. My movie was produced and directed by John Marr, who is with us tonight. And my mother wanted to write the biography of my great-grandfather, but never got to it. So I took the baton and travel it over the finishing line. We have a wonderful movie. We'll show you a clip of that in a little bit. Thank you. It's an honor to be here with Joris and Jeffrey and Bud. So on with the show.
Thank you, Hugh. And Bud, how about you? You have all these images of Bakeland behind you there.
Right, we're coming live from the studios of the edit room where all things Bakelite was put together, really. I am thrilled to be here. Actually, more than you know, my daughter, when she was in high school, received an award for writing, which she received at the Mark Twain House. And I was so jealous. I have been ever since. But now I have something to brag about, being here with you folks here. It was really John Marr who got me interested in this whole subject. He and my brother Craig and I have been colleagues for a long time, working on each other's projects. And when he came to us to help with that production, especially Craig, who edited the film, we certainly recognized this great story. And John is a master storyteller, so we were easily on board with that. And of course, in the process, I met Hugh. And what I was impressed with was Hugh's sincerity and more importantly, his determination, not only to celebrate his great-grandfather, but to present this story with a certain socially conscious perspective that helps us understand where our plastic world came from and perhaps where it's going. And so along the way, I learned more about Hugh and actually some of the initiatives of the LH Bakeland project that he started. And I worked closely with Mark Huberman, the project's media manager. And the two of them really inspired me to get to know who LHB was more deeply. And I became enthralled with this guy. One of the first things I did was, as you folks have done, is read all his personal diaries. And boy, that did it. His diaries are just an amazing window into the soul of a genius, really. And in them also is quite a picture of the revolutionary time that he lived in. So thanks to Hugh, we're currently developing ideas for some kind of literary expression of that. I don't know what that's going to be, but I'm just so excited really to be at just the beginning stages of that work. Unlike my esteemed colleagues here on the panel who have already produced incredibly comprehensive and exciting really books on the subject. I'm honored to be here. And tonight I expect to learn a lot.
Well, thank you, Bud. Regarding Bakeland's diaries, I just like to second that and say that those diaries are a storehouse of information about what it was like to be working in the sciences, in business, in industry, what it was like to be a member of the emerging upper middle class, the industrialist class at the turn of the century. There's a wealth of information there, and I hope you do manage to put it together in a literary way that will give people a sense not just of Bakeland as the inventor of the first synthetic plastic, but as a representative example of somebody alive and observing and writing about the world that was emerging at that time. Anyway, so the film that Bud has been talking about and that Hugh was involved with as executive producer is All Things Bakelite. And I think we're going to see a trailer from that now, so you'll know what we're talking about.
There's no sound post.
Okay, well, thank you. The film itself opens with this wonderful series of shots of people being interviewed in Times Square. Do you know what Bakelite is? And none of them do. And they come up with these incredibly funny guesses as to what Bakelite might be. And I'd like to start our discussion tonight with that series of little interviews and following up from it, because nobody today really knows what Bakelite was unless they happen to be a collector of retro jewelry. But back in the day, 1930s and 1940s, I think Bakelite was a household word. And so I'd like to ask our people on the panel, what happened? How did Bakelite move from being a household word to being something that random folks in Times Square have never heard of? Anybody have any ideas about that?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, okay, I will start. Yes, that is a very notable development. That like how badly known Bakelite is today compared with the situation in the 20s and especially in the 30s. I think part of it has to do with all of these other plastics that were developed in the following decades, from the kind of late 30s, 1940s onward. Plastics like PVC, polyethylene, etc., which had certain advantages compared with Bakelite. In fact, even a larger number of applications. Like Bakelite was sometimes advertised as the material of 1,000 uses, and that wasn't even a real overstatement. It did have an amazing number of applications, but those newer plastics that started coming out did have an even wider range of applications. So I think that's an important part of the story. And of course, the reputation of plastics has also changed very much in the 1930s. It's still an example of just this kind of new technology that generates a lot of excitement. It kind of illustrates the possibilities of chemistry, like synthesizing a new chemical compounds, etc. And we did not have those kind of the environmental concerns, public health concerns we have today related to plastics. So that's, I think, another part of the story, at least for like why our general views about plastics have changed.
Would anyone else like to comment on that? Add anything?
Well, I think that also a big factor in that was when the Bakelite Corporation was sold to DuPont in 1939. I think they absorbed the Bakelite Corporation, and at that point, the marketing of Bakelite, the branding of it diminished. Before that, it was everywhere and publicized well and branded well, and it was a house, as you say, it was a household word. But with the acquisition by DuPont, then even though the product kept being used in various had various uses in industry and continued to be made for consumers, it wasn't in DuPont's interest really to promote it as Bakelite as such. It was now a DuPont product.
But I think it means union carbide.
I'm sorry, I meant human carbide, right. Right. 1939 Union Carbide.
Yeah, that makes sense. The sale of the corporation at that point, which kind of brings up the whole question of, at that point, Bakeland was out of the picture, Leo Bakeland. And I'm wondering to what extent Leo Bakeland and Bakelite basically had to go together, or how important that was in the creation of Bakelite as a substance that everybody was familiar with by the name Bakelite. Leo Bakeland, in his journals, his diaries, talks about an encounter he had in 1918 with the proprietor of a general store on Lake George in upstate New York. And Bakeland was on vacation up there. He just wandered into the store, started talking to the guy, and they exchanged names. And Leo Bakeland says, "Well, you'll have trouble remembering my name." And then as Bakeland recorded in his journal, the storekeeper says, "Oh no, I have a way of remembering names. For instance, when I think of your name, I shall think of Bakelite." This was in 1918, only 11 years after Bakeland first discovered this stuff. And Bakeland didn't spoil, he didn't reveal who he was. But that was how this fellow was going to remember Bakeland's name, because he was well aware of Bakelite. So how important was the connection of the fact that this stuff was known by a name that could be related to the inventor himself? Bakeland had two competing organizations, companies that tried to steal his patents and infringe on them. One was called Condensite and one was called Redmanol. And they eventually combined to create the Bakelite Corporation. He absorbed them, or they absorbed each other. But what if the stuff had been called Redmanol or Condensite? Did it make a difference that it was Bakeland and Bakelite?
Right. I think that that's a really good point. What I've gleaned so far from primary sources and from your two solid histories there, Jeffrey and Joris, were it not for the high level of prestige that Bakeland enjoyed among his fellow scientists and industrialists, academics and government officials, this great network that he built, and were it not for his reputation as the inventor of Bakelite, he was often called a genius. And that was not a little due to his own clever marketing of his personal brand, as we would call it today. Remember, he was a prolific writer, and he worked tirelessly to establish the primacy of his invention. He wrote, as we said, so many diaries, and he wrote journals and scientific papers, and he wrote for magazines, popular magazines, gave speeches, and even testimony in his patent infringement lawsuits. All of these things, his paper trails and his networking, and I guess I would say, and this goes to Joris's thesis, I think, his protective entrepreneurship. He would not have had the leverage of that high status to become the president and face of the Bakelite Corporation, which, as you say, was the merger of his two greatest rivals at the time. So had he not maneuvered this merger, you're right, we may have come to know Bakelite as Condensite or Redmanol or some other fabricated name. And that was 1923, and America was just, as you point out, and describe beautifully in your book, Jeffrey, it was a boom in radio sets at that time, and that brought Bakelite, among other things, into the home and made it a household word because it was marketed as that, and it was Bakelite's, I would say, is crafty maneuverings that ensured Bakelite's prominence.
Joris, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I do. So I agree with what Beth just was saying, but I did want to add that Bakeland became famous before Bakelite. So Bakeland really became known to larger audiences in the United States during World War I, when he was a member of the Naval Advisory Council led by Thomas Edison that was generating a lot of publicity at the time. So they're looking at all kinds of war-related problems that the nation's inventors and scientists had to address. Things like having to do with like submarines or chemical warfare, a range of different topics. And Bakeland was selected by the American Chemical Society as one of their representatives on that committee. And this is really the time when the kind of the national press kind of takes note of him. Before that time, he was already well known by the chemical community and a larger community of scientists and inventors in the United States. But then this is really a point where he acquires this national profile, and that helps also when it comes to promoting Bakelite, as Beth was saying. So he's and another thing related to the use of his name was that to the larger community of scientists in the US, the fact that there was this invention that in many ways was based on science, that this had been made by a US-based chemist, was also something that could really be advertised, and that was being advertised by the chemical community, which was kind of eager to show that, hey, it's not just those German chemists who are able to make those kind of breakthroughs, who had come up with a lot of new dyes, pharmaceuticals, and other major inventions. So Bakeland also served as this kind of symbol of a US-based chemist who had made this amazing breakthrough.
Yeah.
I guess you could add to that after World War I, the chemistry industry, in a larger sense, was trying to defend itself against accusations that they were emergents of war, creating poison gases and such. And so I suppose probably new plastics and Bakelite most prominently gave them something to use to promote the industry itself as benefiting everyone rather than in some way hurting civilization.
Can I'd sort of like to get your take on something, Jeffrey. I thought it was also interesting to note that it was the use and application of Bakelite that informed and evolved the actual meaning of the word plastic. And you talk about in your book the etymology of the word, which I thought was fascinating, going way back to the Greeks and how it's changed through the years to our modern meaning and interpretation of it. But I mean, Bakeland, as I understand it, didn't really know how to describe what he had that well. At that time, you didn't call it plastic as such, because it was generally plastics had a more general meaning. It was later, as the uses and variants of the plastic material kind of informed it and evolved its meaning. Do you think that's true? So it gave rise to a more specific name like Bakelite?
I think that's a really good point. In fact, Joris referred earlier to all the new plastics that came in primarily at the end of the 30s and in the 40s, and especially during World War II, and totally transformed the world of plastics that I experienced growing up in the 1950s. Bakelite was different from things like polyethylene, polypropylene, PVC, which are all thermoplastic. They can be remelted. You can stub a cigarette through them. But Bakelite was different. It was infusible. It resisted heat, resisted electricity. It could be used for electrical insulation. It was tough. And beyond that, it lent itself to being molded in smooth, shiny, reflective curves, unlike any natural material that people have been using up until that point. So it was different. There's a quote in the film, and this was I forget who says it, but someone says, Bakelite changed the way things look. Bakelite changed the way things looked. And I guess my question is there a plastics look? Is it similar to the Bakelite look? What is the plastics look? Did Bakelite influence the appearance of things in ways that are still with us?
Well, the material Bakelite went underground when these other plastics came up. So that's why nobody knows about it, because it's in a lot of applications that nobody thinks about. It's still being made today. It's not patented, but there is, the trademark is owned by somebody, and it's a German corporation called Hessian, and now it's called Bakelite Synthetics. And I'm always interested to know how Bakelite trademark kept going in time from 100 years ago to today. And Joris, I wanted to ask you, who owns the trademark now?
Right now,
Yeah.
I haven't been looking at this lately. I think you're right. Hexion, the company was a trademark holder. I'm not entirely sure about the current situation because the industry has been going through a lot of changes in recent years. Like today, the main center of the phenolic resins industry, which is kind of what the Bakelite industry is based in, is in Asia rather than in the United States, and there's been major restructurings. So I'm not exactly sure. There's one other thing I wanted to mention in response to Jeff's question about the whether Bakelite made us look differently at materials. And I think that one of the, in terms of the legacy of the invention, I think one of the ways in which it was very important is that it made people accept synthetic materials as not just substitute for natural materials like woods or like amber, which was one application that was used in pipe stems, which was an early application of Bakelite as well. So the Bakelite company really had to convince Americans and also industrial users that a synthetic material could be as good or even superior than those natural substances that had been around for such a very long time. And by doing that, by gradually convincing people that yes, a synthetic material could be as effective, could be as aesthetically pleasing, it kind of paved the way for all of these other plastics that appeared in the following decades.
I think it's safe to say that Bakelite itself never had a negative image. It always had a positive image. And that plastics in the 1930s used for things like molded radio cabinets or clocks. Those are the physical, visual consumer products, housings of various kinds of products.
The quote that you, I'm sorry, Jeffrey, I was just
wondering. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to honor the quote that you gave. I think it came from Katerina Posch, who was the professor at Pratt that Hugh and John interviewed. And she's a professor of design there and knows a great deal of history of design. And during that section of the film displays some incredible examples of the beauty and the uniqueness of Bakelite, including a radio nurse. If those who've seen the film know what I'm talking about, or if you can remember this from the 40s, it was the first monitor for babies, and it was designed by Noguchi, and it had a really amazing design to it. In fact, that it looked like a head, and it had a Japanese warrior type of grill work to it, but it was sleek and beautiful. And she talks long about that, and we have a film, a separate film about her lecture on Bakelite design, which is worth checking out on the All Things Bakelite website.
Yeah, but the thing is that what happened after World War II is that many of the new plastics were not nearly as good as Bakelite, or manufacturers thought, well, any plastic can be used like Bakelite can be used. And so a lot of cheap, shoddy products were made that broke easily on toys, that broke easily on Christmas morning, or people were accustomed to a Bakelite ashtray, so they didn't think anything of stubbing out a cigarette in a Tupperware bowl. And so the cigarette just went right through it. And so after the war, when plastics became more lightweight and more disposable, the word plastic began to get a negative connotation, which I don't think Bakelite or plastic had in the 30s or the 40s. I'd like to turn to something else here, and this may be mostly a question for Joris, I'm not sure. But the film, All Things Bakelite, makes a point of talking about Bakeland's reverence for Benjamin Franklin and his self-made rags to riches approach to life, which Bakeland had somehow followed, and admiring him as a lone inventor. But you seem to suggest that Bakeland was not really a lone inventor, that there was more to his work than that. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how your book explores Bakeland's actual process of invention and commercialization.
Sure. That's a great question. So I think when we're dealing with fairly complex technologies that are being developed throughout the 20th century or today, it's rarely just an individual inventor coming up with those technologies. There are always a lot of people involved, and in this case as well, like Bakeland is obviously building on the work of previous chemists and inventors, and there's other people who kind of are doing the same thing at the same period of time, because there's just a strong demand for a product with the technical qualities in like Bakelite in industries like the electrical industry or the automotive industry. So it's not something that just comes out of the blue. It's a topic many people found interesting at the time. So in terms of Franklin, I did find evidence. I do mention evidence in the book that it wasn't just Franklin. Bakeland did have this fascination with people like Thomas Edison, with Alexander Bell, and he was drawn to the United States as a country that seemed to be very supportive of invention and of entrepreneurs as well, of having inventors who could commercially introduce their own inventions and be successful in that way. And so that's part of the story. But I also wanted to highlight in the book that it also was a negative decision to an important extent. Like he had a lot of problems in Belgium at the time. So Bakeland had established his first company in Ghent, in his hometown of Ghent. And as often happens with startup firms, they're running into trouble. I mean, most startup firms fail within the first 3 or 4 years when they're being established. And Bakeland's firm too was piling up debt, and he starts having tensions with his partner. And in this context, I'm not suggesting that that's the only reason why he moved to the United States, but that was part of the difficulties he was dealing with in Belgium at the time that he partly wanted to overcome. And so in that case, as well as in other cases, there's always different kinds of collaborators involved that I discuss in the book. There's also the role of consumers, for instance, early users of Bakelite who are sharing their feedback with Bakeland and his company, and are also making technical suggestions. So it's just a fairly broad range of characters who contributed to the invention commercialization of Bakelite.
One of the things that fascinated me about your book was just the extent to which he was involved on a daily basis with all of the financial machinations that went on in the various patent disputes and joinings of companies and so on. And that kind of runs counter to the impression that the film gives, and that I got from my own study of Bakeland's writings. There's some wonderful quotes from the journals in the film. "What's the use of money if I'm like a squirrel in a cage?" And at one point he says, "I'm worn out. I wish there was no Bakelite." And then there's this wonderful image in the film of him, of an actor who plays Bakeland in some scene, sort of plodding up this abstract steep hill that just keeps going on and on forever. But your book suggests that in fact he was very realistically involved with the firm and had his hands on every aspect of it, not just the chemical, but the financial side as well. I'd like to ask each of you, I think we're running out of time for the main part of the presentation here. What's been overlooked so far in our discussion? Hugh, what have we not said that you would want to say?
I would say that Bakeland was of two minds about a lot of things. He hated going to the patent lawyers and the judges, but then he loved the combat, the fight. And Joris makes that point in his book.
And Bud, what about you?
Well, this might be a subject for another hour, but I think one of the legacies of Bakelite that you can't ignore is what is called in the film the double-edged sword. There is the promise of Bakelite and all of the doors that Bakelite opened, for sure. But there's also the peril of it. And the pollution problem of plastic is so huge. And I would love to get into that and actually bring it around. I think there's a tie-in to Bakeland because he even suggested that he would love to ghost walk in the future. And if he did ghost walk and started walking along our beaches and started kicking up some of that plastic trash, I think he'd head right back to the laboratory, roll up his sleeves and find some kind of pollution solution for plastic in biochemistry, which was one of his real interests. And we have his exact words on that. And some of it is quoted in the film. And we have a letter that he wrote that talked about that. And if we had time, I would love to read some of that, but that may be a time for another discussion, because I think we all have an investment in this that has to be addressed, industry as well as consumers, to make to take away the linear economy of plastic from take and make and waste, and move to a circular economy where there is no waste and pollution. But that may be another subject.
Thank you, Bud, for raising the whole environmental issue. I had intended to do that. I'm a novice at moderating, and I realized our time was up. I've only gotten through like a third of my questions, but what about you, Joris? What have we not addressed?
Yes, I also have a couple of big topics we have not yet talked about. And I think one of the main ones is that Bakeland's legacy is not just about Bakelite. He has done all these other things throughout his career. And I think one of the main aspects of one part of his legacy that is central to how I write about Bakeland in the book relates to his being an early example of a scientist entrepreneur, someone who's really engaged in both scientific communities and in industrial business communities, who familiarizes other scientists with technical issues related to intellectual property, who created an industrial research fellowship at Columbia University, thus kind of straightening ties between universities and industries at the time. And there really are some quite fascinating parallels with contemporary cases, like for instance, the case of Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier, who won the Nobel Prize in 2010, the chemistry Nobel Prize. So there's also this very close relations between the involvement of these scientists in commercialization activities and like applying for patents and all of the financial stakes involved in the area of technology in which you're engaging, and close links between that part of the story and the actual scientific work and the actual scientific recognition they're getting for their contributions. So there's those notable kind of entanglements that are very common today, and were also common in Bakeland's time, but that's much lesser known, and far fewer people have written about it.
Thank you, Joris. And I think Jennifer has some questions from the audience that she's going to share with us. So we'll move on now to the Q&A part of the program.
Wow, that was and is fascinating. Thank you all so much for sharing all your knowledge. And it is frustrating, Jeff, to not have been able to get to all the topics that we wanted to cover. So I'm hoping maybe we can reconvene another time and continue this conversation, because there's still, I think, a lot left to be said about Bakeland and Bakelite. The audience does have some good questions, but I'm going to jump in. Sometimes I invoke host privilege. Before we have the questions, I want to give the documentary another try. The gremlins, the tech gremlins that had left us alone during our tech run came in, but let's see if we can get it to go now.
What is Bakelite?
This is the world's first synthetic material, Bakelite. the very first plastic. One summer night in 1907, this material settled in a test tube in my great-grandfather's laboratory.
Leo Bakeland really stands at the forefront of polymer chemistry.
Other chemists found a wall. Leo leaned against this wall and found a door.
It's the latest thing, it's all the rage. Let's sing the praises of the polymer age.
Bakelite was the first real molding material from which one could make virtually any shape one desired.
So Bakelite provided an open-ended play field for American designers.
This is a Bakelite guitar made in 1940, a Rickenbacker.
Plastic has promised that we can mold, make, or create anything we can envision.
It's that cover your grandmother puts on her couch.
Plastics is both the finest and the worst expression of humankind. A world without Bakelite would require an alternate universe.
Bakelite! Bakelite! Bakelite!
Oh, wow. I cannot wait to see the rest of that film. And my colleague Jacques has very kindly posted in the chat a link by which you can purchase or find other ways to view the entire documentary. And I know what I'm doing this weekend. I'm going to be reading and watching this documentary. I'm so fascinated. So I do have one more host privilege question before we go on to the audience questions, and that is, can any of you tell us anything about, I think that Mark Twain and Bakeland knew one another, is that correct? Or at least met?
I have a photograph of Mark Twain with his wife, Celine. I assume Leo Bakeland took the picture, but it's in my family archives. And I needed to share it with you. And I'm glad it was confirmed that it's actually true.
And I understand that you've actually come to the Mark Twain house with questions about what were the circumstances of that photograph, and not been able to find anything out. So that's another.
I'm looking for the provenance of it.
Okay, well, please keep us posted on that, if you will.
I will.
Okay. So our audience has some great questions, including our colleague Brian Greenfield, former executive director of the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center right across the lawn. She is a scholar in material culture. So she says, are there any problems preserving Bakelite as a historic material in museums and other collections? Great question, Brian.
I know it doesn't react well to ultraviolet light. That changes the color.
Interesting.
Yep.
Do any of the others of you know anything more about that?
I think it depends on the which specific applications you're looking at. I think that the brittleness was one of the main technical weaknesses early on, and I think that has caused some issues in certain cases. But I think it really depends on like whether you're talking about radios or it's used as a varnish or some other kind of application.
Most Bakelite is being used as a laminating glue to hold wood together in plywood, for instance.
Interesting. So I sense that there's a little bit of a divide in our audience, all the kind of industrial applications versus what we know in our homes. And I was sharing with you my Bakelite jewelry, and that's how I've come into contact with Bakelite. So I think people are interested in both. And so Carol Wolf asks, at what time did Bakelite become popular for jewelry? And she has some and wonders if it's valuable.
I'll tell you that one. It was basically in the 1920s, and Bakelite phenolic resin, phenol formaldehyde resin, was cast in translucent colors, bright translucent colors, in rods, in shapes. So if you had a little napkin ring, a Scotty napkin ring with a hole in it, That would be one long, huge extrusion and would just be sliced off in the shape and then polished. And at that point, phenolic resin, which is Bakelite, couldn't be used to mold big things unless it had a filler in it, like ground slate or wood flour or asbestos or something like that. But the pure thing could only be used for very small things. And so you had this colorful cast phenolic resin, and jewelry was made out of it, chess pieces, things like that. And that became popular in the 20s. It was actually first introduced by a Bakelite competitor after Bakeland's patents expired. But the Bakelite Corporation quickly began making that same stuff.
And how is it valued today?
I go to flea markets. I don't know what I'm talking about really, but say 20 years ago it was very expensive. The price has gone way down lately, and now I see it going back up again. So I think what's happening is an older generation is getting rid of the stuff they collected 20 years ago, and a younger generation who sees it saying, "Hey, this is cool stuff."
Yeah, the antiques roadshow, you'll see a lot of Bakelite.
Oh, interesting. And how do you know if the piece of, for instance, jewelry that you are looking at is in fact Bakelite and
You
not
rub it until it's warm, or put it under hot water and smell it. If it smells like formaldehyde, it's Bakelite.
Who knew? Wow, that was worth the price of admission right there. Thank you. And I do remember going to antique shows or flea markets and seeing the rods, long rods of Bakelite that had not yet been processed into individual pieces. So that's a cool artifact too. Looks like we have another question. Let me just go. And I'm sorry, I'm working off two screens here. So, well, I think we addressed this a little bit, but maybe you want to talk a little bit more. Cheryl wants to know, was Bakelite as much a pollution hazard as modern plastics are?
I can briefly speak to that. I think one of the interesting things raised by the history of Bakelite is just how long it often takes, how long it can take until certain hazards are becoming obvious. Like even today, the EPA is still working on guidelines related to formaldehydes, emissions, and potential health hazards posed by formaldehydes. Asbestos was included in many early applications of Bakelite, but at the time, people weren't really aware of the kind of health risks we now know can result from exposure to asbestos fibers. So it's really this kind of long process where it's mainly in the post-World War II decades that there's this greater awareness. And as for asbestos, there's actually kind of some litigation that happened on the part of employees in the Union Carbide factory against the company, which led to some issues that made it more difficult to access certain records because of their value in the context of this litigation.
Thank you. Does anybody else have anything you want to add to that? I have to say, unless I missed it, I'm shocked that we've made it all this way into the program without mentioning The Graduate and the famous Blind Plastics. So I had to do it if you guys weren't going to. And I know that our technical host, Francis, is working right now to try to post that photo that we were just talking about a moment ago. So maybe we can comment more on that once she's able to do
How about you in the audience? The list of streaming platforms to watch the movie.
Well, I'm going to do that after, rather than have me rattle them off. I'm going to post those in the chat. And I'm glad you brought that up because the program is being recorded and the chat remains live in perpetuity. So as soon as the program's over, I'm going to post that list of places where you can stream it. And people can take a look at that. So it'll be, just seconds after we close, but I don't want to monkey with it right now while we're on screen. But thank you for reminding me about that, Hugh. That's helpful. So tell us what we're looking at here in this photo.
The woman without the coat is Leo Bakeland's wife, Celine. And to her right is a woman who we don't know, and to that woman's right is Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens.
Yeah, that's undoubtedly him. And I know that you, as you said, you had spoken with our curatorial staff some time ago and not been able to determine when and where this photo was taken. I think this is a great mystery.
It was the early 1890s, because this house was rented by Bakeland in Yonkers, New York,
Okay.
before he bought his mansion in 1899. So Mark Twain visited this house and my great-grandfather in the early 1890s.
But you don't know, there's no record of a correspondence or friendship or business relationship?
No, I don't have any record of that. However, I think Bakeland attended one of Mark Twain's toga parties. Do you know about Mark Twain's toga parties? At CCNY in New York, City College of New York, Mark Twain had toga parties.
We don't know of his having had toga parties at his home here in Hartford. I'm guessing
No.
with his family that he was raising there, he probably did not do that there.
No.
But
Save that for the big city.
okay. Oh, I'm so glad we got to look at that photograph together. And again, maybe somebody will have some insights as to what was going on there and how that came to be taken. So please, if anybody does, please share, let us know.
All right.
So audience, any more questions? I just wanted to say that I really had, again, I only knew of Bakelite as material for poker chips and earrings and necklaces and pins and stuff that I like to buy, but hadn't really thought about the other applications and implications. And how fascinating and how interesting that all of you have gravitated in one way or another to research, study, and know more about this the phenomenon and this material. What's next? What can we expect from any of you, Bakelite related or otherwise?
Bud, do you want to mention our initiatives?
Well, certainly the LH Bakeland project is a group of folks that Hugh has assembled together, and we're interested in keeping the dialogue open about the use and misuse of plastic, and the further marketing of the film, All Things Bakelite, in symposia and in academia and available in on streaming, will keep that dialogue going, I think. So the LH Bakeland project is going to remain active, and I'm hoping that, as I said in my intro, that Hugh and I can get together and write some kind of popular book about Bakeland.
Well, I would look forward to that.
And I'm working on a book on the East Bay Kodak, the photographic giant. So it also builds on the Bakeland book, because Bakeland's first companies were in the photographic industry, and Kodak even bought his first successful company, and I became really interested by just the power, the extent to which Kodak was able to dominate this entire industry, not just in the United States, but also in Europe, Central America, and elsewhere. So that's what I'm working on.
Oh, wow. Look forward to that too.
That's important history, because digital photography is now taken over.
Wow. Well, you have to promise to come back and talk with us about this project and the book when they're ready for public consumption. This has been so much fun. And I would like to just list the places where you can stream all things Bakelite, The Age of Plastic. You can check it out on iTunes, Apple TV Plus, Google Play, YouTube, and Domestic Voodoo. And again, I'll put those in the chat, but Jacques has again put the link for all things Bakelite as well. So I gotta say, what a fantastic evening this has been. And I don't know where Jeff has gone. I hope he's okay. But Jeff, come back if you can. I also want to say this is our first adventure in closed captioning. And I'd love anybody's feedback as to how that has worked out for them. So thank you, Francis, for making that work for us. And thank you, all of you, for what a wonderful, fascinating panel. And I think Jeff was the one who said we could have gone on for hours more. I know that we could have. So let's just plan to get together again soon and talk about Bakelite again. Thank you all for being here. And thank you to our audience for your participation and your great questions.
Nice to see you, Joris.
Nice to see you. Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you.
Night, Jennifer. Thank you.
Night.
Good night. So nice to meet you.
Good night.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.